Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Behind the Post. Here with me today is one of my amazing colleagues and the Director of Social Strategy here at Oktopost, Jennifer Gutman. Jen, I am so incredibly excited to be here with you today, and I couldn't think of a better guest to kick off the first show with me. You are truly the B2B social media extraordinaire, and I'm so excited to dive in. Jen, are you ready to go behind the post with me?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Amazing, amazing. So before we start, I know our Octopus community, they love you, they know you, but I'm sure we are going to have a few new faces tuning in. So if you could just kind of take a second and tell us a little bit more about your journey and how you came to be the social media expert that you are today.
Sure. So I will definitely take it back a little bit, and it's an exciting journey, I think. And what I've learned in this field is you're either a career marketer or a marketer, an accidental marketer. And I like to joke that I'm somewhat of an accidental marketer. I got my start in social media. I was always interested in it. When I was in college, and I'll take it back, that was 2004, right? So that's exactly when Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and all these social networks were first starting to be. My university was one of the first universities that Mark Zuckerberg had chosen to have, the feed, if you will. And we were getting really excited to have a college email to open a Facebook. Fast forward a few years, and I was actually working in the security industry. And part of my job at that time was scouring the dark web, if you will, for threats. So, for example, specifically looking at Twitter and trying to understand, and this was like super early social listening, right? But
Mhm.
trying to understand what threats might be taking the community. So, one of the words we had put in our keyword searches was bomb, right? And as the young person that I was, supposedly the one who knew social best compared to all of my colleagues who were maybe in their 50s at the time, retired police officers and, CIA and FBI. I got really excited when we had all of these hits of the word bomb until I started to realize sentiment, right? Because in the English language, there's a really great slang. I don't even know if it's still used today, but right, if something's the bomb, it means it's awesome. It does not mean there is an actual bomb. So that's really where I got my start in the interest and the power of social media. And from that experience, I had actually found Oktopost when I was exploring potentially different tools that I could use to help the security industry identify threats. And with Oktopost, what became very interesting, right? It was for B2B marketers. And you think that for B2B marketers, right? Okay, at the time you could use all these different tools for social media, but at that time, when you think about what a B2B marketer specifically for social needs to measure and look at, it's very different than a B2C marketer, right? We're more interested in understanding what conversion social is bringing, or the first touch of where someone is interacting with us. It's not always the same with a B2C company. So Oktopost caught my attention. I moved across the world, to Israel. Oktopost is, a startup in the startup nation. I was super excited to join it. And I started as the first ever customer success manager here at Oktopost. And I was working day in and day out with our clients. I was learning the Oktopost technology and becoming more and more and more obsessed with social media. And even so I joined the company in 2014. We're now, 2022. That's enough time for the social industry to have changed and shift so much, right? Since I even became interested in it and started working in it. So I think, to answer your question, it's a little bit about my journey. So I went from customer success manager to then, selling Oktopost and in sales. And they say the best marketers were in sales. So I found it a natural path to then, move into the marketing role here at Oktopost. But I really think that the fact that social is so dynamic and changes every day is what makes working in it really exciting, really stressful, but also really exciting. And I'm sure you can relate.
Yes, definitely, definitely. And thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your background. And today's episode is so exciting to me because it's no surprise that you love social media. I love social media, but I feel like there are still a ton of misconceptions about social media and social media managers today. And I hope this show is going to shed a little bit of light on that. But I asked you here today so we could kind of break down some of these misconceptions and myths together and things that are kind of floating around the social media world because social media is rapidly growing. It's a top growing marketing channel, and there's a huge emphasis on social media right now, more than there ever was. And it's not something like, oh, it's just nice to have. It's a need to have, it's additional demand generation channel, and you can really use it to grow your company. And it still is kind of a little crazy to me that there are some people that haven't fully adopted it because of some of these misconceptions that are floating around. So I thought that we could kind of walk through and break some of them down together.
I love that. There's a ton out there. Yeah, let's dive in because I'm sure you've heard them as well. I know you're quite the social ninja yourself.
Thank you. Okay, so the first one is something that is very near and dear to our heart as Octoposters, but I think some people are seriously thinking that this is not possible. But you can't measure the ROI of social media.
Okay. This one absolutely gets under my skin because it's simply false. You can absolutely measure the ROI of social media. It's very, very easy, especially if you're using a social media management solution. However, I can understand why this is a common misconception and why people often say this, because what is hard to measure when it comes to social and marketing today is that there's so many different touch points where a customer can start connecting with your brand. And it's no longer, oh, person A saw this ad made them pick up the phone and call this company. And then that salesperson closed the sale. And you can clearly see that journey or buyer path. And so I think because of the nature of the way people buy today, the misconception isn't that you can't measure the ROI of social media. It's more that it's just very difficult to understand your first touches with your buyers. But taking it to social media, it's actually quite easy, right? Because at the end of the day, yes, I think when social media was first getting its start, and for even today, right, we're looking at vanity metrics a lot of the time to understand the success of what we're doing, right? So we look at how many followers do you have and how many likes do you have? And the problem is when social media managers go and speak to the executive team and say, yes, we have 500 likes on this post. Now, between you and I, like, we know 500 likes on any post is a reason to celebrate. That's incredible. And when you get that many likes, I mean, does that mean it went viral? Like, you're patting yourself on the back. This is amazing. But when you take that to a CEO, they're not quite sure. That's not their language. And I think there's just been a big discrepancy between the language we as social media managers speak and the rest of the organization. Because at the end of the day, when you're sitting under the marketing team, you need to impact revenue. You need to help sales drive their numbers. And if you go to your CEO celebrating 500 likes, they're probably going to be really excited as well, but not quite understand why. And they're going to ask you, amazing, 500 likes. What does that mean? Does it mean we have 500 new customers? Does it mean we have 500 new opportunities? What does it mean in terms of revenue? And that is, I think, where the disconnect started, because we weren't speaking the same language. But fast forward, right? And I'll throw Oktopost in there just because I'm completely biased and it's the tool I use day in and day out. But what you're able to do is really follow the journey of your audience on social. If they're interacting with your brand and clicking on links in your post, you're able to identify social conversions, right? And once you're able to capture that social engagement data, identify who's converting from your social posts, and then pump that data into Salesforce or pump that data into marketing automation platforms, and then give that data to your sales team so that you can start understanding where in the sales journey or sales funnel social media is playing a big role, right? You can absolutely justify the ROI. And it's the same, by the way, with employee advocacy. I don't want to leave that one out either. employee advocacy, there's a really easy way to measure the ROI, right? Again, when we look at employee advocacy as marketers, we're like, yes, we're going to, expose and expand our reach tenfold. But when you say that to an executive team member, there is a little bit of a disconnect. They're going to be excited. They're not going to know exactly what that means. So it's our job to break it down and really show the ROI. So I would say that misconception that you can't measure the ROI of social media is false.
Very good. Yes. Myth busted. We can prove it, and Oktopost can show you how to do that. So I love that. And the next one I want to jump into is something that I actually feel very passionate about. And this is the more followers, the better. So I'll start this one off. And I know at first glance, when you hear this, you're like, yeah, of course, the more followers, the better. Like, we want to grow our brand, we want more followers. But the way I see it, I would rather have less followers that are really engaging than more followers that aren't engaging with my content, aren't really interacting with it at all, aren't interested. Because yes, we are on social media to grow our brand, grow our brand awareness, but at the end of the day, we're using social media to meet our marketing goals. And our goal isn't just to grow a following. And I just personally think it's more meaningful and impactful when your followers are actually engaging with your content, it's resonating with them, you're reaching the right audience. That's just kind of my take. How do you feel?
I definitely would agree that the more followers doesn't always equal better. But I would say that a decent amount of organic followers, I'll say engaging followers, gives your brand credibility, right? So if you go out there and you're opening up, your LinkedIn company page or your Facebook company page or opening an account on Instagram, and you have, I don't know, 400 followers across each channel and a very engaging channel, you shouldn't stop the goal there. And I think where the challenge comes in is balancing, right? Because you want to be growing your follower base with the right audience, right? The right audience, in our opinion, I think we can both agree, is an engaging one, right? So someone who's going to be engaging with your content. The whole point of social is to be social. So as you're growing your followers, I think the challenge comes in with how do we grow our follower base while continuing to increase engagement? And that's like the constant balancing act that takes place quarter over quarter. It's our biggest headache. We love it. We hate it. We'll see our followers are going up and we get really excited, but then engagements are going down. So how do we get those back up? Then we see engagements are going up, but that our followers are kind of standing at a stagnant, standstill. So for me, that's the challenge. But I definitely think that you don't have to have, 100,000 followers, especially today, to be taken seriously across social. There's this even kind of new concept of micro influencers, right? And
Mhm.
so, before, I think a lot of brands were like, okay, let's do influencer marketing. Who has the most followers? And let's get them involved with our campaigns and our strategy and helping to get our name out there. And then people started to realize that getting in touch with these influencers is actually quite difficult. And there's a lot of noise going on. And perhaps your competitors, they're promoting your competitors as well. So if you start going after micro influencers, right? And that kind of hits with like, they don't have the most followers. So kind of proving the more followers doesn't equal the better, right?
Mhm.
But these micro influencers are very in touch and aligned with the messages that your brand is promoting. And I think you'll get more meaningful engagement. And again, like exactly what you
Mhm.
shared, it goes back to your marketing goals. But yeah, total misconception that the more followers are better.
Yeah. And I'm happy you brought in micro influencers because I think it's interesting because influencers, yes, they do have a smaller following, but their community is so engaged and tight knit. And the results you can see with a micro influencer are can be so much more impactful and powerful than with like a mega huge influencer with a million followers. It's kind of crazy when I see posts about that, and seeing the engagement that these micro influencers get. It's really honestly inspiring. But this next one, I think is kind of funny, and people do think like this, but hire a millennial and just let them post your content, no strategy needed. So this is funny to me because just because you are millennial, just because you are tech savvy and you're on social media, doesn't mean that you know how to do social media well. And it honestly makes me laugh because, yeah, you could hire a millennial and just be like, okay, here's social, go for it, run, post for us. But without a strategy, without goals to kind of back you up and that strategic approach, look, what are you going to be posting about? What goals are you trying to reach? Or are you just kind of like aimlessly posting?
So I'll definitely share that this misconception, I think, helped land me my first exposure to social media, because at the time that I took over the project for, scouring the dark web, the dark social web for threats, I was the only millennial at the company. And that's exactly why they gave me the project, right? So to some degree, this misconception helped me get my start in social. However, I totally agree with you that if you are thinking of hiring a full-time social media person, you probably, first of all, you probably want to now hire Gen Z. No, that's a joke, but you need to be quite strategic. I don't know. I'm sure there's tons of millennials that are great social media managers, but I do agree with you, Olivia. Like you have to think about the strategy, and there's a lot that goes into it. I think millennials and different generations, they understand social, they understand the power of social, whereas perhaps like the baby boomers, maybe you need to explain the power of it or the impact of it a little bit more. But I do think that yeah, no, you don't just make sure your job description says millennial. You really have to have a strategy behind it. And yeah.
Okay, I totally agree. And this leads nicely into talking about strategy in our next myth. So, up next, we have you need to have an amazing strategy and a consistent presence on every social media platform. And at first glance, like, oh, yeah, that sounds nice. We want to be consistent. We want to have a presence on every social media platform. But for me, when I think about how personally I use social media, I don't have an active presence on every single platform. I have my one or two that I go on every single day that I'm really active on. And when you kind of think about your customers and your prospective customers, you have to imagine that they kind of act in a similar fashion. And as a social media manager, it would be nice if we could have a crazy active presence on every social media platform, but I feel like it's just not very ideal because it's very, very time consuming to create content. And I think you also need to keep in mind where your audience is hanging out. So I think
Yeah.
if you first identify that, yeah, they're on LinkedIn and Instagram, well, that's where you want to focus your time. It wouldn't make sense to be having a crazy strategy for Facebook if no one's on Facebook. So that's kind of my take. I think you kind of have to see how your customer might be using social media and see where they are hanging out the most, and then create your strategy from there.
I'd absolutely agree. And as a social media manager, I think that this can be very overwhelming. I walk those shoes and I remember being very overwhelmed because there's always something new, right? There's always a new platform. There's always a fear of, am I missing an opportunity? Am I, missing out a FOMO? Like, am I missing out somewhere? And I also think a few years ago, it was actually best practice. There was like this saying, and it was, everywhere about, hey, your customers are everywhere and you need to be where they are, because if you're not where they are, you're going to miss out. And that was a common practice a few years ago. And I think now, as a social media manager, we are seeing that if you can pick one social channel or two social channels and do them out of this world amazingly better than anyone else versus all social channels and do them kind of half baked, but be on all of them, your audience, kind of going back to that original, misconception about, your followers, but your audience is going to be more attracted to your pages that are going all out instead of being half baked just so you can be everywhere. And I think another important thing to consider as a social media manager is, yes, when we think about social media, we're talking, LinkedIn, we're talking Twitter, we're talking Facebook, we're talking Instagram. I know TikTok, comes up quite a bit now. But I think it's also important to recognize where your customers are hanging out, even not on social media, depending on what industry you are in, and be there as well. So like, if for example, and for most B2B companies, LinkedIn is where your buyers are hanging out, you're going to be on LinkedIn. You're going to need to come up with a way to break through all the noise, and you're going to need to do LinkedIn well. However, perhaps there are, and I know this works in our industry, but there are a lot of Facebook groups where people feel more comfortable sharing about any challenges that they're having at work or questions that they have about technology, and they're sharing them in marketing groups. So if you think you might have some interesting audience members or potential buyers hanging out in these types of groups, I encourage you as a social media manager to join those groups, become part of the conversation. Because again, it's not just about posting on your corporate channels, but being social, right? And I'm going to keep saying that, but right. I think that is a misconception, that if you're everywhere, everyone's going to see you, but that's not true. And sometimes you're able to better break through the noise when you join some of these groups, and you can see firsthand what your community is speaking about and be part of it, instead of the lurker, if you will, or the megaphone that you're just putting out content one way. So I would encourage, even though, and LinkedIn groups was a thing, they're less of a thing now, but for anyone listening in, I think if Facebook isn't your place, maybe it's another channel, try to figure out where your buyers are hanging out, your customers are hanging out, and join some of those groups and become active in them, because I think it's another space that sometimes is forgotten, again, because how do you measure it? It's a little bit hard to measure participation in a group, but you do gain a lot of insight. And even as you're creating content for your brand, you might be inspired from the conversations that are taking place in those groups.
Yes, of course. And I think it's like, you don't need to be the loudest on social media. You just need to know who you're trying to reach, and then go reach them and identify where they are. So it's not about being the loudest, because you're not trying to reach everyone on social. So it's about going after exactly who you are trying to, and coming up with a strategy to find them. So absolutely. Thank you for shedding some light on that. So up next, I kind of have a Jen question for you about social media.
Okay.
And this is something that I kind of want to ask all of my guests moving forward, because I think everyone might have a different perspective on it. But when we are talking about the social media world and working in social, what is one thing that you wish your colleagues in other departments knew about social media?
All right. I've worked in social for so long, and I think the one thing I wish my teammates knew was how absolutely time consuming and stressful posting on social media is. Let me explain, right? So it's really a strategic channel, right? And people don't really see that. They literally think, okay, I have this piece of content that I would like to go out on our social channel on LinkedIn. Let me send it to Jen, or let me send it to Olivia, and they're going to post it out. And I love receiving that type of content, right? Because I don't think there's any social media manager who is ever not in a need for content, or always looking for new content. So I always encourage my team to send pieces of content. But I think what gets frustrating is I'll get pieces of content and they'll say, okay, can you post this today? Can you post this tomorrow? This just went live 5 minutes ago. Can you get it up on social now? And I think that's what drives me bananas, because one, there's a lot of right, to go ahead and create a tweet, for example, like a witty, intelligent, smart tweet, you need to know or have read what you're about to post on Twitter. And even if you scan super fast, you still need to have a pretty good idea about what you just read. So that takes some time. And then to formulate a tweet, right? It's a certain number of characters, but it takes time. And it's the same for LinkedIn. And I think we all have days, like if you think about those days that you're sitting in front of your computer and there are sometimes your brain is just not working. Like you're just like staring at the screen. You have what you need to post on social, you have all the links, and you're just like, there's just like nothing going on. So that's the other challenge, is that it's time consuming because we're also humans and we need to process and be creative. And how many ways can you say the same message over and over and over again in a creative way? So I think that adds an element to it being super time consuming. And people think, oh, it's just putting a post up on social, because they only see the final result. They only see this small little post that maybe has a shelf life of a few hours before they never see it again. So they don't really realize how much time and energy goes into that. And then I say stressful because social media managers are really on the front lines. And there's been a lot of studies in 2020, 2021 about this. No surprise, but social media managers are really on the front lines of everything happening in the world, whether it's fake news, real news, any type of news, what competitors are up to, what customers are saying. And when you're living in a digital world day in and day out, your mental health can really take a hit. And I think, again, our colleagues don't always realize that on a daily basis, right? They go on social media for fun, right? After their workday, maybe they've had a long day developing, some product lines, or they've closed amazing sales. And then they just sit back with their, cup of coffee or at their happy hour, and they scroll through Instagram to see what, everyone else is doing on their happy hour. And for us, I mean, there are some days where I don't even want to look at my phone after work because I've been on it all day. So I don't know. I think that's another piece that I wish the team just would recognize, is that for us, social truly is 24/7. And it's time consuming and it's stressful.
Definitely. There is so much that goes on behind the feed that people don't realize. And another aspect to kind of the content is, when you are putting a piece of content out on social, you have to have a why. It's not just we're posting on social today because that's what we do. We have to be on social media. No, every piece of content that goes up, you have to ask yourself, what value is this providing for my audience? And that's just one little piece of this huge puzzle that we're trying to do with social media. And there is just so much to it that I think that if you're not in the social media industry, or you're not even, connected to social, you don't really understand everything that goes into creating the content, scheduling the content to, how it's going to fit in with the rest of the content that you're pushing that day, to your strategy. And it's also challenging because just creating content is not the only part of your job. You also have the managing part of it. You're managing the platforms. Like, you're on these platforms talking to your community, responding to comments, engaging, asking questions. And then if you have an employee advocacy program, you're also creating content for your advocates. There's just so much that goes on in the social media world. And I think another myth or misconception that kind of flows into this is social media is easy, because when you look and you're scrolling your feed, seeing that 2-sentence tweet, you're like, oh, that probably didn't take that much time. But sometimes I even get fooled by this. I'll sit down to write content and I'm staring, just like you said, I'm staring there for a half an hour. I'm like, I thought this was going to take 10 minutes. And now I'm sitting here tweaking the wording. I'm going back to the article. It really takes a lot. So I'm so happy you shed some light on that, because if you're not in social media, I don't think you fully understand.
Yeah. Yeah. And I also think, going back to that piece of just being time consuming and adding to the stressful piece, right? It's really hard as a social media manager. I don't know if you ever feel this. So you have an idea of what's going to perform well. you and I, we have our weekly chats about what is driving engagement and what's not. And we go through and we see that our milestone campaign or our, company wins or company culture campaigns are usually the highest when it comes to engagements. Or if we add a photo versus no photo, the posts with the company photos will get more engagement than just some text, right? And we go through and we analyze, we're like analysis by paralysis here, going through to try to do the next best post. But at the end of the day, I think the unknown, we still, at the end of the day, we could literally take that exact formula that we saw performed well last week. We could take the exact, right, like feel, language, campaign, photo, and we could post it that following week, and it will have absolutely no leverage. Nobody's engaging with it. And I think as a social media manager, that you have to have the ability to be okay with uncertainty and the unknown, because you don't always know what caused your post to go viral. And the post that's performing well, sometimes your manager will come to you and be like, oh, well, why is this post performing so well? And deep down inside, you're like, I don't actually know, right? And maybe you're like, oh, well, it had this image and it doesn't make any sense why that specific post is doing so well. And I think that's why social media managers, we really need to stick together and share with each other what we're doing. Because if, for example, you go and look at your competitors to get some ideas, right? And you're like, wow, that works for them. And you try it, it doesn't mean it's going to work for you, and vice versa. So that level of stress and trying to always be one step ahead and learning, yet you don't always know like why something did well or why something didn't go well, right? It's the same thing. You could literally spend an hour creating the most beautiful LinkedIn post and it goes live and you have like this go live anxiety, right? When it gets published and you see it and you get really excited. Maybe you, as your social media manager, like your brand's content because that's just how excited you are that it went live and you're the only like, right? That's the worst feeling in the world. And you're so defeated and you just sit there and you're like, did I fail at my job? Am I going to have a job? Right? Like all these things go through your head, but there is no playbook. And I think that, right, that adds to the stress, that adds to the fact it's not easy, right? In sales, ultimately you can kind of figure out, right? If you're selling to someone and maybe your discovery call goes south, you can learn from that and improve it. And most likely your next discovery call, if you tweak one little thing, isn't going to go south. But with social, you can tweak and tweak and tweak and tweak. And then suddenly there's no explanation. So I think that's another piece, speaking about what you wish people knew about it, or if anyone listening in, right, can relate to that. I think that's important to call out. And that's what adds at least to my anxiety when I'm doing social posts, because I really just have no idea how the world's going to react to it.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's so funny when you work so hard on one post and it doesn't get the engagement you're hoping for. And then another post that you never would have thought would have performed well, like totally knocks it out of the park. And you're like, what? Like it's sometimes you're just like, what is going on? So I think it's really funny to kind of go through and see what content is performing well and resonating, because it's not always what you think.
No.
So funny. Okay, so I want to wrap up the show here with something that I'm going to do with my guest every single week. I think it's a fun way to wrap up the show and a fun way to provide value to other social media managers out there. And we are going to take an anonymous question from our audience and our community and kind of break it down and give some advice. So how does that sound to you?
I'm a little nervous, but let's bring it on.
Okay, so today's question is, how can I make B2B social media content less boring?
How much time do you have? That's a really good question. I don't know if anybody has mastered that yet fully. So let me take a moment and think to make it less boring. So I'm going to probably throw this back at you, Olivia, in a moment, but I think one of the things to make it less boring is you don't always have to stick to the convention that every other B2B company is sticking to. For example, right? So there's kind of this, or maybe in the past, there was this formula, right? Where you write a little bit of content and you post a link leading someone off of social to that link. And that was pretty much standard B2B. Hey, I'm leading people to my website and I'm going to put this third party piece of content. And that was, if you didn't do that, you were like an outcast and maybe a little strange and not, it wasn't necessarily acceptable. But I think to become more interesting on social, you have to take the risk of going against what everybody is doing. Yes, add value, but I think the posts that I see performing the best are the ones actually without link attachments and that are getting, okay, now this is, I'm going to say it, but it's getting personal, being authentic without crossing the line of unprofessional.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a hard space to be in. But I think that that's how you can be a little bit more, I guess, less boring, because you're bringing a personality, whether you're posting as yourself, as an advocate, or you're building your personal brand, or even as the brand. You don't always need to speak in third person, very matter of fact, but you can play around with the tone and you can play around with, first person, perhaps.
Yeah.
But again, I think there is like this gray, and I think we're still experimenting with it now, where on LinkedIn, what is considered too personal? Is there such a thing on social media as being too personal? I don't know. But yeah, I'd say trying to be a little bit more, less of what everyone else is doing and being a bit more you.
Mm-hmm. When I saw this question, what I kind of like immediately jumped to is being more human, because I think B2B kind of has the stereotype of being a little boring because it can sometimes be very product focused, and it doesn't always need to be. Of course, that's a huge element, but I immediately think of, okay, how can you make your content a little more human? Because yes, it's business to business, but we hear this a lot. At the end of the day, it's really human to human. I feel like that's kind of like been the trend and it's kind of ingrained in us now. And I think when you kind of are scrolling your social media, you connect with another person. We're human, like we connect with each other. And if you can try to find a way to tell stories and incorporate that human element, I think it really pulls you in and engages you more. And sometimes it's not always about what you're saying, but how you're saying it. And it could be something more heavy, like a product feature or a webinar that you're promoting, but that's going into like a deep dive on a topic. It sometimes can be more heavy, but I think it's how you say it and how you tell that story that really engages people and brings people in. And you can add more media, you can add more videos, but for me, I think it's like adding that human element like really makes a difference.
I definitely would agree with you on that, about the human element. And it's challenging. It's definitely challenging, but I think some of the things I do to look for inspiration, I don't always just look at our competitors. I think the B2C world, honestly, truth be told, their feeds can be really interesting, even though they're measuring different things than us in terms of metrics and goals. The way that they connect to their buyer is really unique. And I think we have a lot to learn from our B2C counterparts when it comes to being interesting on social media. And I think taking intelligent risks when it comes to social, right? At the end of the day, what's the worst that happens? Something goes out, it gets zero engagement, or it doesn't quite fit. You can always delete it. But I wouldn't be afraid sometimes to take that risk, because just like you don't always know what's, a post that you're creating and you think it's going to perform really well, you might take a huge risk and it will have a massive payout. And I would also advise not to necessarily give up so quickly, right? Because by doing one post differently, it's not really going to tell you anything at the end of the day. You kind of have to do almost like a social campaign or a few posts differently and then measure over time to see that impact. Because if you're only looking at one post, how it performed. There's so many factors that go into it. Time of day, for example, or the actual piece of content, or is anything in the world going on that day that could have affected people, seeing your post or engaging with it, or their mood. So it's also a lot about timing, right? So I think that's another thing to think about is, as a social media manager, what's really cool to make your content creative is you don't always have to stick to, yes, you want to be on brand, but you don't always have, you can talk about, hiring, you can talk about work from home, you can talk about, challenges in the workplace, wherever. It doesn't always have to be about product to be interesting. And social does give you, it's a unique channel, right? It gives you that space as a brand to let people know what your brand is all about. That kind of goes into employer branding, which I'm sure can be a whole nother episode. But I think it's an interesting question. And, Olivia, as you do these shows, I'd love to, I'll keep listening in, because I'm sure, specifically this one, like how are you going to keep your content creative on social? All of us are in that boat. I think all of us are Googling daily, like how do I diversify my content? How do I keep it creative?
I know. I mean, honestly, we could just keep going on and on about it. There's so much to kind of unpack, and it's changing every day. Like you said, it's, social media moves so quickly and it's always changing, and we're always trying the next best thing. And, sometimes it doesn't work out, sometimes it does, but that's social media for you. So thank you so much for joining me on the very first episode. I loved sitting down with you, and I'm so happy that we can actually share this conversation with our community.
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun.